Before I begin this podcast, I'd like to alert everyone to the fact that this may not be suitable for children. Please be advised of that. Now, as early as this past weekend, November 5th, 2016, I heard myself saying, well, okay, but what if I were a man without a penis? What say you to that? Now, I'm not going to tell you what question that was my response to, but really doesn't matter. I'm off the rails. And so aren't a lot of people. Now I'm speaking high up from my perch in Massachusetts, the only state, let me remind you, that voted for McGovern. And we owned the bumper stickers that said, "Don't blame me, I'm from Massachusetts," when the Watergate scandal broke open. Anyway, I've had discussions with a few people who were nice enough to try to calm me down and assure me that these community projects that are my passion right now could be done on a community level. And that's why I'm starting off with this message. There are other ways to do these wonderful school programs to feed our children healthy food. It doesn't have to be from the top down, because we all basically know that trickle-down theories pretty much defy gravity. So I'm asking this. Anyone listening to me that would like to start programs like this in their community to contact me, and we'll start a group. Doesn't matter which kind of group, any kind of group. A Facebook group, a Twitter group. Perhaps we'll just all email each other. I've got a lot of contacts who can help with this. I've mentioned John Pelletier, who used to work in Salem, Massachusetts for the mayor under the Mass in Motion group, which handles projects like this. If you want information on Mass in Motion and how you could start that in your state, John Pelletier is the person to ask. What I'm also asking, basically, is for us to all come together to try to find ways to fund this. Now, I worked with one school, the Bentley School, and we did this whole thing from scratch with John Pelletier's assistance, and it worked. We used recycled wood that was weather treated to make our raised beds, got a relatively inexpensive composter, got the first and second graders to water the ground and dig up worms for us. The third graders planted the tomatoes, and the older kids were being taught how to cook. We did a video of the planting and got the kids involved with every step of the way. That could happen on a community level, and I'd love for us all to come together and find a way to do this. I will give you my email here, which is jtiberio, Tiberio, another J, 14@gmail.com. You can also go to my website and contact me through my website, healingoutsidethebox.com/contact. Another way you could help me very much is to donate to this podcast through Patreon. And whatever money I collect, I will put toward getting some treated, recycled wood, etc. Because ultimately, we adults may be upset at what is happening right now, but we can't let our children down. So let's not give up on the kids, folks. By the way, you can get to my Patreon page by just typing in my name at patreon.com. Any contribution would be very appreciated. Thanks so much. Now back to the podcast. Hey there, I'm Jean Tiberio, and you're listening to Healing Outside the Box. Today is episode 114, and I'm calling it If a Body Catch a Body Coming Through the Rye. And yes, you would be correct in assuming that I'll be talking about Catcher in the Rye, and I'll also be talking about rye bread, that is. Now, in the book Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, Holden Caulfield mistakenly quotes a line from a poem by saying, "If a body catch a body coming through the rye." The poem was written by Robert Burns sometime around 1782, although the exact year isn't clear from the various places I searched. The poem is called Coming Through the Rye, and you can Google it if you want to read the whole poem. The line from the poem actually reads, "When a body meet a body coming through the rye." But why all this fuss about a 1951 novel by J.D. Salinger, and why bring it up now? This is a novel about teenage angst and alienation. One could argue that it's also about adult angst and alienation. And this could perhaps be a good time to bring up this subject again. 5 nights ago, my sisters and I went to a movie called Coming Through the Rye, written and directed by Jim Sadwith and starring Chris Cooper. The movie was shown in one of those old coffee house screening rooms with only about 40 sofa chairs and 3 couches. The really cool part about the showing of this movie is that Jim Sadwith and Chris Cooper actually came by to answer some questions and talk about the making of this film. Jim Sadwith revealed at the beginning of their discussion that he wrote the screenplay based on his own life. He was the teenage boy who actually experienced desperately attempting to, and finally succeeding in, meeting J.D. Salinger. The fact that this kid, Jim Sadwith, actually was able to meet and talk to J.D. Salinger in his living room was the thing that won the respect of his fellow students. And that was for his perseverance and, as we would say now, grit, to meet his goal of meeting J.D. Salinger, who was notoriously a recluse. Here's a quote from the description of the novel Catcher in the Rye. "Perhaps the safest thing we can say about Holden Caulfield is that he was born in a world not just strongly attached to beauty, but almost hopelessly impaled on it. There are many voices in this novel, children's voices, adult voices, underground voices, but Holden's voice is the most eloquent of all. He issues a perfectly articulated cry of mixed pain and pleasure, but he keeps most of the pain to and for himself. The pleasure he gives away or sets aside with all of his heart. It is there for the reader who can handle it to keep." End quote. Descriptions about the novel by other writers bring it to life to some extent. The problem is that J.D. Salinger, and now his children, are holding tight to their rights to the actual words. Sadwith told us in the screening room that Salinger said, quote, "The boy and his friend are my children," end quote. Everyone in that room could read between the lines, basically which said that Salinger's children would not give this screenwriter the opportunity to actually quote lines from Catcher in the Rye for Sadwith's movie. Like other things in life, I suppose, we left the screening room somehow wanting more, like a visit from J.D. Salinger himself rising from the grave. What we did get was to meet the author of this boyhood story about meeting J.D. Salinger himself, and of course Chris Cooper, who played J.D. Salinger brilliantly in this movie. Now on to the actual topic of this podcast, which is to talk about the actual grain called rye. First, let's go through a quickie food analysis of a typical slice of rye bread. One thin slice of rye bread, approximately 25 grams, a bit less than an ounce, contains 65 calories, 2.1 grams of protein, which means that 2 slices will give you 4.2 grams of protein, which is pretty good. Total fat, 0.8 grams, also pretty good. The total carbohydrate is 12 grams, and only 1 gram of that is sugar. The fiber is 1.5 grams per slice, but this is going to vary according to how dark or light the rye bread is. Now, rye bread is a type of bread made from various proportions of wheat flour and rye flour. There might also be coloring agents in it, so I suggest that you look on the ingredients label if you're interested. They do this because they want you to think by looking at it that it actually has more whole grain than white flour or dark rye. As I've said, there is actually a range of light to dark rye, which most people know. The common light rye bread is actually about a half wheat flour and half rye flour. Whole grain rye bread has a heavier texture than other breads due to the low gluten content. Whole grain rye bread with added grains actually goes way up in its fiber content, and that makes sense. And will have a higher vitamin content as well. In other words, if you add seeds to that, like caraway seeds, it has a more favorable effect on your blood sugar because there's more fiber. Now, pure rye bread contains only rye flour without any wheat. An example of this might be the German-style pumpernickel, a dark, dense, and closely textured loaf. It's baked for long periods at low temperature in a covered tin, and it has a lot more fiber, about 2 grams of dietary fiber. And actually, this could help you if you're trying to lose weight because it promotes a feeling of fullness. And this might encourage you to eat less. Fiber can help lower your cholesterol as well and decrease your risk of developing diabetes. The whole reason that the rye fiber makes you feel full has got something to do with a specific type of carbohydrate called non-cellulose polysaccharides, which have a water-binding capacity and gives you that feeling of fullness. Now, if you're interested in what type of rye bread you're picking up and putting in your grocery cart, look at the first ingredients. It usually tells the story. If wheat flour comes before rye flour, then it has more wheat and not as much fiber. And again, you can look for dyes or colorings, which will also try to convince you that you're eating more fiber than you actually are. And if you want 100% of any whole grain, you will see 100% rye flour or 100% whole wheat flour on the label. So there you go. If you have any questions about rye flour or Catcher in the Rye, actually I'm not the expert on that, but rye flour, feel free to email me, jtiberioj14@gmail.com, or you can ask me a question on my contact page. Again, it's healingoutsidethebox.com/contact. Again, I look forward to hearing your feedback on the issues I discussed earlier in the podcast. So that's all I have for you today. Be well and stay tuned next week for another episode of Healing Outside the Box.